best possible use we could make of our current resources. So with this, we can think of different categories of existential risk. The most obvious one, the easiest one to understand, is human extinction. And so if humanity goes extinct, then our capability potential will drop below the threshold, that is the minimum threshold needed for sustaining human beings. We need to produce a certain amount of food and clean water and have a certain population density, etc., in order for the human species to survive. And the axiological potential as well would then fall to some level, either zero, or if you think that there is value in the natural ecosystem, it might fall to some level below absolute zero, but still a low level. And then it stays there for a long time at least. Now we can think of a number of different specific risks in this category. These are not necessarily listed in order of severity, and some of these requires actually looking at a specific definition. But there is some rough indication that the ones higher up are more likely, and they are all related to, it's interesting to note, to technologies, the ones near the top. Okay, so this is fairly, so human extinction, it's like kind of easy to see what it is and why it would be bad. For each of these specific risks, one can then consider various assessment parameters. Probability that they will ever happen, that they will happen before some given date, the conditional probability that it will happen if nothing else kills us before, the degree to which they are amenable to mitigation, whether they're correlated with other things, the degree to which you would be likely to get advance warning if one of these risks were about to materialize. Many others, the degree to which there is likely to be a consensus or dissensus among experts that the risks are real. So take superintelligence, a lot of people will think this is a very big and grave risk, and others would say that we are not even going to ever be able to build that, it's just fantasy. And so a risk like that, there might be a lot of disagreement about, whereas the risk of a meteor strike, say, I mean, most people would agree that it's a real risk and a very, very small risk, and there's really not that much room to argue about that. Now let's move to a second category of existential risk. This is the risk of unrecovered collapse. And this would consist of a scenario in which we lose a very large part of our current capability potential. We revert to some more primitive level of technology and economics. And then we stay there. So in order for this to be realized, it's got to be permanent. If there were a big collapse of the world economy and global civilization broke down, but then say after 1,000 years dark age we crawled back up again and then continued as before, then it would not count as an instance of unrecovered collapse. So it's only if the collapse is actually never going to be recovered that it would count as an existential risk. And there are many causes one could think of that could cause a global collapse, but much fewer of those could plausibly be supposed to be permanent. And there are a couple here. There's some sort of ecological degeneration so extreme that all the raw materials that a civilization would need to climb back up the technological ladder would have been depleted. A repressive global government that somehow managed to perpetuate itself, and that was completely hostile, say, to economic prosperity. Dysgenic selection and some others can be imagined. Then we have a category which is a little bit problematic. So it's not a real category of existential risk, it's a kind of a dummy variable that is needed in the analysis. This is to represent the possibility that although it seems that there are these immense values that could be realized only with much greater levels of capability than we have now. I mean, in fact, all these transhuman values that would need radical life extension, molecular nanotechnology, cognitive enhancement. Although it seems to many people that there are these immense values that we need more technology to realize, now it's theoretically possible that that view is false, and if that, then the following categories of existential risk cannot be realized. So let's just put this on the map. What could this kind of lack of potential? Well, there could be some philosophical impossibility. These things are just not very valuable, or there could be some practical infeasibility, that it's just not possible for people starting with our current level of human intelligence to develop the technologies to solve these problems. This doesn't seem very likely from our current vantage point because we're making so fast progress right now, but it's at least a logical possibility. But if we assume that there isn't this lack of potential, but there actually is the huge potential, then another kind of existential catastrophe would be the permanent failure ever to realize that enormous potential for realizing human value. And this would be called permanent stagnation. And here again we can think of a few possibilities. Perhaps the most, well, one obvious one is some kind of permanent suppression of progress. Imagine a kind of global pernicious world government that had enough technologies to keep itself stable, maybe some perfect light detection technology or surveillance technology, but that for whatever reason had this locked-in ideology that it needed to prevent all future development of humanity's capability potential that could count. The missed axiological deadline, this is still work in progress. I'm not really quite clear about how that works, but if, for example, keeping current human beings alive, if what has value is only currently existing human beings, then as they are dying off, then we might sort of permanently miss the deadline to realize the huge value of extending these people's lives indefinitely. Then we have the interesting category of flawed realization. And this is where capability, the realization of capability potential, the dotted line, comes apart from the realization of our axiological potential. This would represent a scenario in which humanity, our descendants, develop wonderful levels of economic growth and technological capability. We might have, space empires with nanotechnology transforming planets into computers and all of that stuff. But when all that capability is not used for anything that really has fundamental value. And here are a couple of different specific risks of that kind. Imagine an unfriendly superintelligence that achieves great, it takes power and then manages to continue to perpetuate itself by spreading into the universe, transforming all the structures it encounters to more and more computational hardware, and all of that computational hardware is used to calculate pi to ever more decimal places, or to make paper clips or something stupid like that. This might be a very technologically capable civilization. It might have the ability, all the resources and the ability and intelligence to do whatever it wants, but just happens it doesn't want to do anything that is valuable. Another type of scenario here would be where you have a kind of ethical blunder. You could imagine some sequence of human enhancements or modifications where each step seems attractive in its own right. We think we're becoming a little bit more like we want to be. But as you keep transforming yourself in small steps, you lose at each step something subtle that wasn't obvious. You enhance an obvious property while you're losing out on something that is really important but not so obvious. And at the end of this transformation process, you might have transformed yourself into something that, from our current vantage point, would look horrid. And finally, we have the category of ephemeral realization. This is where you, at least for a while, realize some wonderful post-human state, and then it erodes away long, long before the universe runs out of steam. There are a couple of different, several different scenarios in this category. One is forms of evolutionary competition, where you might have a future ecology of uploaded minds, for instance, that for a while have great resources and are flourishing and realizing enormous value, but then some of them start out-competing others because they devote all their energy to making more money so they can buy more computational hardware so they can make more copies of themselves. And the ones that engage in valuable activities are gradually out-competed other instances of this. So to conclude, I have suggested that we are perhaps in a situation with regard to existential risk, not very different from the situation where these people in Britain were back when the Black Death arrived. They could sort of sense that there was some bad thing that could happen, but they didn't really know how to effectively go about doing anything about it. And if the sort of holy grails of risk mitigation are in this citadel there are kind of 3 walls blocking our entry to that. There's a lack of understanding about what we can do, which is in turn caused by a lack of research and analysis and thinking about this. It's the second wall, and that in turn is caused partly by a lack of action, such as funding research and supporting analysis, which is the third wall. But it's hard to get the action going until you have the understanding, and it's hard to get the understanding until you have the research, and you don't get the research until you have actual support and funding for it. And so that is sort of where we currently stand with regard to existential risk mitigation. Thank you.